You can drive perfectly and still spend most of your time in the least efficient part of your EV's operating cycle. Not because you accelerated too hard or because you drove too fast, and not because you set the climate control wrong, but because of when you're measuring the system. If you've ever noticed that a quick run to the cleaners produces a disappointing efficiency number, while a long drive across town looks better and a road trip sometimes looks surprisingly strong, that difference is not random. It's not mood, and it's not the car deciding to cooperate one day and not the next. It's about which phase of the drive dominates the average, and most short trips are dominated by the wrong phase. Efficiency in an EV is simply energy used divided by distance traveled. That sounds straightforward, but what matters is how that energy is distributed across the trip. Every trip has two broad phases. There's a transient phase at the beginning where the systems are stabilizing, and there is a steady state phase where most loads settle into a predictable pattern. On a short errand, the transient phase can dominate the entire average. On a longer drive, that same transient phase becomes a small fraction of the total. That is why a 3-mile trip can look inefficient, while a 40-mile drive in the same car feels consistent and strong. But before we go deeper, it's probably worth asking why anyone should care about this at all. If you charge at home and electricity is inexpensive, does efficiency even matter? For most owners, it matters less because of the cost and more because of predictability. If the car shows 4 miles per kilowatt hour on one drive and 2.8 on another that feels similar, that variability creates uncertainty. It makes range feel less stable, and it makes the system feel less intuitive. What people want is not perfection, they want consistency. And so understanding how trip length weighs different phases of operation explains the inconsistency without blaming driving style. So let's look at what actually happens in the first few miles. When you first start an EV that has been sitting, several systems wake up at once. The battery management system evaluates temperature and may begin heating or cooling the pack toward an optimal range. The cabin HVAC system ramps up to reach the temperature you requested, and power electronics move from ambient temperature toward their designed operating range. Tires that have been sitting cold begin to flex and warm, which slightly changes rolling resistance, and various accessory loads stabilize after the initial surge. None of this is dramatic on its own, but in the first few minutes of a drive, these transient loads can request a meaningful share of total energy use. Now imagine that the trip is only 2 or 3 miles. The distance is short, so the denominator in the efficiency calculation is small. If a meaningful amount of energy is consumed early in the trip, the energy is divided by a very small distance. That result is a lower miles per kilowatt hour average. It is not that the car is inefficient in a permanent sense, it is that you measured it while the system was still settling. Now contrast that with a drive across town where perhaps 12 or 15 miles are on the clock. The same transient phase occurs at the beginning. The battery may warm, the cabin reaches its target temperature, and electronics stabilize. But once those systems settle, the car enters a steady state pattern where loads become more predictable. HVAC becomes a background draw rather than a spike. Thermal management tapers, and the car spends more of its time cruising at a relative consistent power demand. In that case, the startup energy still exists, but it is diluted across a longer distance, so the steady state phase dominates the average. That dilution effect is the key idea in this entire discussion. Now though, we have to address speed because this is where people get confused. Higher speeds absolutely reduce efficiency once the car is in steady state. Aerodynamic drag increases with the square of speed, and maintaining higher velocity requires more power. If you compare two fully stabilized highway cruises, the faster one will generally consume more energy per mile. But drive averages are not determined only by steady state drag, they are determined by which phase of the trip dominates the total. On a long highway drive, even though speed reduces steady state efficiency, the steady state phase may represent most of the trip. The transient phase becomes a small fraction of the total energy. The average reflects mostly stabilized operation. On a very short trip, the opposite can happen. The startup and thermal phase can represent a large fraction of the total energy simply because the distance is short. So even if the vehicle never exceeds 40 miles per hour, the average can look worse than a longer highway drive where steady state dominates. This is not because speed is suddenly efficient, it's because weighting matters. Consider 3 scenarios. First, we'll look at a quick run to the cleaners, 2 miles away. You start the car from cold, the cabin begins warming, and the battery management system is active. You encounter a few stop signs, and then you arrive. The car may have just begun to settle into a stable pattern when you shut it off again. The efficiency reading reflects mostly startup and short interval operation. The second scenario, though, is a drive across town of maybe about 15 miles. The same initial stabilization happens, but after the first few miles, the system spends meaningful time in a steady state. Even with some traffic lights, there is enough distance for the average to reflect stabilized operation. Now consider a third scenario, a 200-mile road trip. There is one startup phase at the beginning, and then the car spends hours in steady state. Even if highway speed reduces per mile efficiency compared to slower cruising, the transient phase is now almost invisible in that total average. These trips will feel different and display different totals because they are different in structure, not because the car is inconsistent. When people look at the dashboard and see that a short errand produced a mediocre number, it's tempting to attribute that result to driving style. Those factors can matter, but on a very short trip, they may not be the dominant force. The dominant force may be that the car simply never reached a portion of the drive where loads stabilize and energy use becomes predictable. The efficient part of the drive is not a specific speed, and it's not a magic mileage threshold. It's the stabilized phase where transient spikes have faded and steady state dominates. The exact distance to reach that phase varies with ambient temperature, parking conditions, preconditioning, and driving pattern. And in the cold, stabilization may take longer, while in mild conditions, it may happen more quickly. The point is not the exact number. The point is that there is some phase shift. Short trips may end before that shift meaningfully influences the average, and longer trips almost always include it. Once you see this, the variability in efficiency readings stops feeling so mysterious. A short errand and a cross-country drive are not comparable in how the system is weighted. One is dominated by transient behavior, the other is dominated by steady-state behavior. Understanding that difference does not require you to change how you drive, and it doesn't require you to optimize for perfection. If you primarily use your EV for short fragmented trips in your home, you are often measuring the system during its least representative phase. And if you evaluate that same vehicle over longer distances, you are measuring it during its most stable phase. That is what the first few miles of every EV drive are really about. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.